Hi again. In this session, we'll look at how we can extend social protection coverage. So, just to link it to where we were last time, is we are looking at these three objectives. So now we wanted to look systematically how we can increase this coverage. So how we can include everyone into social protection arrangements, so no one left behind. So the model also, when we look at social policy instrument, it's very important for us to differentiate between two things that when we look at analyzing any policy instrument. One is the vulnerable groups, and this is the who. Right? Who are the ones that vulnerable, could be vulnerable and could be behind. So whenever we talk about no one left behind or covering for all, because this is like the language of human rights that we cover all, we need to look at the vulnerable groups because those are the ones we think that might be left behind because of their vulnerability. So to reach to the all, then it's important to zoom in specific population group, so that might be left behind in actualization of specific human rights. So for the vulnerable groups, obviously we can talk about persons with disability, women, senior citizens, population living in rural communities and villages. You name it. You based on the policy instruments that your vulnerable groups. But the other area where we also look at the same time is what deprivation. So it's not enough to say social protection, but what social protection? Because pregnant mothers, she cares about maternity benefit, not the whole system of social protection, but that is specific coverage. So in general, in social policy, it's important to play with these two things. So if we talk about persons with disabilities, what they are missing. We look at education, for instance. That's not sufficient to say education. You need to zoom in. Is it primary education, secondary education? Is it preschool? Is it post-secondary education? So it's very important, to disaggregate. So the idea here is the interaction between who and what. It helps us to actually to reach to the full coverage that we're looking at. It helps us to zoom in. So many times we've seen in social policy, one of the issues nowadays that you'd see recognition that here the vulnerable group that we can extend it, or we can disaggregate data. What we've seen here is the deprivation. The what is that with many indices, they try to create a composite index that cover all of them. So it's important again not to create like maybe that index just to track something, but in terms of implementation, it's very important to look at specific deprivation one by one. Right. And the second issue also in social policy that I've seen is that many times we kind of mix between deprived and vulnerable. So for instance, person with disability. Is it deprivation or vulnerability? We need to be clear, it's vulnerability. It's not anything wrong. So somebody with disability, it's okay if they access health, education and other things. There is nothing wrong here, but it becomes a problem if a person with disability not accessing education or healthcare systematically discriminated against. So it's when we use vulnerability, we need to make sure that we don't stigmatize. It's not like something that is bad or wrong, but rather what are the missing dimension of deprivation. So it's important to keep this in our mind. So, and this is related also like when we look at the SDG and the SDG target 1.3, which is on social protection. What we see here is all, the word all. Right? And the word all, as we said, we need to disaggregate. And this is what we see in the indicator, right? There is level of disaggregation. It's saying children, unemployed, and that's very important. So all, because it's a human right language, that higher level, that to ensure that everyone access social protection. But it's important to zoom in. So the indicator now comes in to help us to say that we need to focus on children, women, unemployed, older people. And this is very important. Now to get into like the implementation, what I usually do in every country that I work in social protection is to create this matrix. And in this matrix, I put the what and then the who. The very same logic we looked at. The what, like child benefit, old age, you can think of the what is the 9 contingencies of Convention 102. Right? So this gives us, the what. And once you have it here, you would see that there is contribution, like this is Argentina, that you see Argentina in terms of the what, they have good coverage. The 9, they have good coverage. And this is contributory, mandatory contributory. But where we see that the bad coverage, so the what is very good here, but the coverage gap, we see it in terms of like the who. Certain groups are not covered, right? This, when we see V, it's voluntary. It's also like voluntary does not produce good coverage many times. Right? If you look at another country, for instance, Syria, just before the war, I did some work there. And this is what you see common in many countries. So in terms of the what here, you see missing special unemployment, sickness, maternity, you see missing what? Certain dimensions. So this is missing, right? So you see gap in the what? Healthcare in Syria was universally coverage, and there are certain price subsidies to cover everyone. You buy bread, it's subsidized at that time in Syria, right? But what you see here is the mandatory coverage is very small, limited to only the formal sector. But the self-employed, you voluntary, or you keep going, like there is no coverage here. So no coverage here. And this is common. You would have coverage for the formal sector and you have coverage to the very poor. But in between is not. Right? So you have coverage at two ends. One is the very poor and one is the formal sector. To put it also in different way of visualizing is that this coverage at two ends, if common in many countries, if you are part of the salaried employment, so you're part of the formal sector, so you work whether in the government, in the civil service, or you might work also in a bank, international bank, or you work, the salaried, and usually those are covered. Those are covered by contributory, but they also can cover themselves in voluntary insurance, right? They buy their own financial products for, let's say, for old age retirement or for the rainy days, whether it's work-related injuries, not working, unemployed, their voluntary insurance will cover them, right? But also they access in contributory. And then you have the very poor. In many, many countries, you have so many programs targeting who is poor, who is not, right? And then what you don't have is a coverage in somehow the middle. And the middle here, we need to understand it does not really mean only poor or informal. It means that maybe professions, certain doctors, I'm like, let's say somebody's a medical doctor, has a clinic, private sector clinic, makes good money, but it's not covered because he is self-employed or she is self-employed. Right? But it also includes the informal sector in rural communities, they're not covered. And what we want in social protection is to break the silos. So firstly, we need to get those who can afford it. Remember, I said the medical doctor, we need to get them here. Because here, where you can create cross-subsidization from the rich to the poor. So you need the ones who can afford it to be here also to contribute for the others. But also the ones who are excluded from the poverty targeting, who are poor, we need them also to be here. Right? So we need to close this coverage gap by moving people to both ends, or bridging the coverage gap, bringing the two sectors here. Right? And this is easy to say but hard to implement. But let's look at one by one why it's hard to implement. As I mentioned, if you are a salaried employee, then you are covered. More or less in most countries, they have contributory or kind of coverage for the formal sector, at least the civil service. And what we've noticed in many countries that that they are covered, very well covered in terms of the contingencies. So we see in many countries they have old age retirement, they have maternity, work-related injuries, civil service or military. They have them covered, like healthcare. So you have good coverage here. But and if you part of the civil service, you receive the pension. So there is no coverage gap if you are one of the lucky ones who are in the civil service, let's say. But where in many countries we have an issue with adequacy. The benefit is not adequate. So some countries they are, but some countries what we've seen for the contributory system or the social security arrangements in the country, that the replacement rate is low. And this what happens usually. It starts in many countries, starts, like the pension very good, but because of lack of indexation, they didn't keep the value. So countries, it's very difficult for them to reduce the value of pension. But over time, the inflation will eat up the value of the pension. So that's why we have adequacy issues in many programs. But then the other issue is, if we want to expand it to the other sectors who are not covered, how we will expand it to the other sectors. And this become a problem because this coverage is only for the formal sector, but in many countries, the essence of the labor market is informal. And the second, so the informal is very difficult to get them here because you don't know their salary level. The second issue here is the future of work. Now, today's many of the young generation, they prefer to start their own business, which is great, that create resilience in the labor market. There's nothing wrong about, being self-employed. But the problem if there is lack of protection. So many times they are not protected. So, but the future of work is there to stay, and these programs sometimes it's difficult to cater for them. There is a gender dimension to it, which, because it's very important, we'll come back to it in another session. In the next session, we'll look at the gender dimension to it. But if we look at the informal sector, for instance, here, why it's very difficult to rely only in contributory system. It's great if we use contributory system, you contribute for your retirement. But the reality here, if you look at, countries from low-income countries, on average, 81% or 4 out of 5 of the labor force participants, they are informal. So the overwhelming majority, they are informal. So to use this arrangement to, the contributory system, very complex. You might capture, doctors, you might capture taxi drivers, government can make it mandatory for taxi driver to contribute to here. You can capture certain professions, but, how it becomes harder, to capture the informal sector in the rural communities through contribution. When their wage level is very, very difficult. It's hard for them to sustain, or to have enough food on the table, and then you come and you say, save for the future. So it's very difficult to reach these groups, right? But it's also not only low-income country. If you look at even lower middle-income country, you would see 68% to more than 2 out of 3 informal. But even if you look into upper middle-income countries, some of the countries you see here are already OECD countries, the developed countries. But the average is 46%, right? It's 1 out of 2. So there is limitation for this one because of the issue of informality in the labor market. And because of that, it's not surprising that you will have lower coverage, right? Because of this, because of the informality, you see that countries, if selected countries here, this from the World Development Report of the World Bank, you see that countries, the coverage in here 30%. All these countries, they don't have good coverage, right? And simply, again, because if you go back, it's because of the informality of the labor market and very hard to extend. So now we know we need to extend, be creative in another way to extend coverage. But if you look at the other end, one end is if you are salaried. The other end, if you are be able, to demonstrate that you are poor. Many countries, they have so many programs, and many of times this fragmentation will result in lack of coverage, as when we talked about targeting type 1 and type 2 error, right? But what you see, for instance, common across many countries, that these programs are very fragmented. You have the government with so many programs, and you have the NGOs, you have the civil society, you have different groups trying to provide food to the poor, or if you have also low-income countries, you have many donors, and donors compete with each other. Developmental agencies, all of them, they are crowding the scene for creating small programs, pilots, and they justify it why it's small. It's not pilot. It's because their budget is limited, and they cover a few just to check the box that we provide in coverage. And this is very important. Why? Because this will result in exclusion error because of complexity, as we discussed, and inefficiency. And if you look at, for instance, Malaysia here, look how many programs, 110 programs provided by 25 government agencies. This complexity has a price, right? That has exclusion error, as we discussed. But again, like this is one end, and this is the other end here, like this coverage gap, it has a gender dimension, which I will look at it in next session, discuss why there is a gender dimension to it. But for now, it's just like to understand these silos. We need to break these silos. We need to get this here and get this here, or move people from the doctors, the ones they can afford it, or, like countries need to, like be creative. Many countries that taxi drivers, for instance, Uber or whoever, you cannot register to practice unless you contribute for your retirement and work-related injury. The last thing you want a taxi driver to get into an accident and does not have an income replacement, so it's very important, like many countries, they make it mandatory. Doctors, professions, it's easy to move them, to this by making it mandatory at, the level of the authority that or organize this profession. So you can move, but because many informal sector, the very low wage earners, you need to get them here, right? So it's very important to break the silos here. We need to break the silos here so we can mix these together, so we can bridge the gap. And this is exactly what we need. So, but for us to break the silos, we need to have two more objectives that will help us to break the silos. The two more objectives is we need not to have like one slice, not to look at social security for the formal sector or for poverty, or one NGO has one sector. We need to have a system. So it's very important to have system. We need to have a system view. Once you have system view, then we need to say we need to create, like the objective is to create cross-subsidization. Moving, like the ones they have to support the ones they don't have. So cross-subsidization, as I mentioned, the rich, the ones they can afford it, you need them to be in the system, so you create this cross-subsidization. So this overall system in terms of impact will be impactful because you have wider coverage and you have leverage that you can cross-subsidize from the rich to the poor. The second, and this is the overall system, not at scheme by scheme, because might be a scheme is saving for the only for the members, so there is no room individual saving account, there is no room to move from one to another. But when we put it in the whole system, that they somehow part of the system, then you can create the cross-subsidization. The second important objective when we try to mix these three silos together is to know that once you create synergy between them, not necessarily to create one system for all, but to create synergy. The easiest thing to think about, if you create data harmony, like harmonization of data. Many countries, you have this fragmentation of, like what I mentioned in Malaysia, of 110 programs. You have also fragmentation of the databases. That will allow certain people to move from one program to another, knowing that they will not be captured. So in any way, if you create like harmonization of this program, you create synergy at data level, at also benefit level, as well as you can top them up. So if one benefit is low, you know that you can create, synergy between them. So these two objectives are important. So we need to bring together not only the social, not only, like the tax fund finance, but also you need to bring the social security. Many NGOs, many, United Nations agencies, they're very comfortable of the social, of the tax finance, spend, cover the children with this benefit, cover senior citizen, and less comfortable. ILO is a leader actually in this, but other agencies, they might not be very comfortable with the social insurance. So we need, to work together in create, governments need to create the linkages between social insurance and the tax finance. And it's also like the private, I put it, like in brackets, but also you need to create as well with the private, like the, at least at the regulation level of the financial products available. So you need to create like a spectrum of benefits that speak to each other, but at least it will close the coverage gap. So to move from here, the silos here, you need to organize it in a systematic way that it helps us to, to achieve coverage, no coverage gap. And we'll look at it as we move on in the last session. But the idea here is no one left behind can be established at the social protection floor. And this is the ILO recommendation 202, establishing social protection floor. Right? And what you see here is for, social pension, like a few things, but you have, as we already discussed, like how this will work. But this will be very minimum level. It cannot be generous because it covers so many groups, right? Again, when we say all, it's not every member of the country, but all, it means, senior citizens, they are vulnerable group, all vulnerable groups. Maternity is vulnerable group, it's all maternity. So it's not like 100% of the population. We need to be careful. It's not universal, it means 100%. It means all senior citizens, and senior citizens in low-income country on average 3%, in low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's not 100%, it's covering 3%. And out of the 3%, you might cover it starting as 70, or so it might be 2 to 3% senior citizens. You add maternity, another maybe half percentage point of the population. So it's not really like 100%, but again, the vulnerable groups should be covered. And now, because this is minimal, you need to create the incentive for people to save. So now with this and this, then you reach the recommendation Convention 102 of the minimum standard, whether it's 40%, 50%, depending on the benefit. So at least with this, you create the decent pension or decent benefit. At this level is the very minimum level, because you need to keep it minimum to encourage people to be here also. And then, the rich, they can acquire a higher level of protection. We'll come back to this discussion as we move on in second session. We'll look at gender issues, but later on we'll look how we can reach this one in the last session as well. All right.